The global classroom is starting to slowly come alive. I walked in here to give this lecture and I saw some desks and things moved around, which means that there's life returning slowly but surely to the global classroom and to the building in which it sits, the Center for Collaborative Education. And so maybe that's a sign that things are getting better, that maybe we are starting to get beyond the worst of this 2-year pandemic that has turned everything upside down. And as you'll see in the story of the human race and the building of human societies, the outbreak of infectious diseases has been a common part of our story from very early on and has done some serious damage to societies, brought down, along with other reasons, but has been a principal reason in the decline of some empires that you're going to see. So it is possible to get better. And that's something that is really important to understand in terms of the idea of humanity that we are exploring in this story, the story of humanity. Remember, there are really 3 dimensions of humanity that we are looking at. There is this idea of humanity, humankind, or once upon a time mankind, but we say humankind now, and of course humanity. They mean the same thing, humankind and humanity. Then there's humanity in terms of humanness. And that is more and more important as we move into the future in this century and in this 3rd millennium, because humans have developed powerful machines, their tools and technologies have developed to the extent that we can now create artificial forms of life and even artificial forms of humanness. It's Frankenstein, if you will, coming to life. So being able to understand what is distinctly human and why it will always be so important on this planet, why no matter what kind of machines that we create, what kinds of artificial intelligence we create, what kinds of spiritual machines that might be created, as some futurists have described them today, spiritual machines. I don't believe that the idea of a replacement for us is coming to this planet anytime soon, because we have special qualities, as you will see, and nature evolved these qualities over a very, very long period. And I'd like to help you to understand what they are in these lectures. So that's the second definition of humanity. And then, of course, there is humaneness. This idea, perhaps I could even put it into a 4-letter word that is a good 4-letter word. God knows we've got enough 4-letter words in social media today. It would seem like if you looked at the way humans are communicating in cyberspace today, and a visitor from another planet came to see how we communicate that way, God, would they be depressed if depression were a part of an alien sensibility. But we know that our ability to communicate and interact goes a lot deeper than a lot of the junk that is communicated in social media. So there's a 4-letter word called love. And the human being has a remarkable capacity for this. That is an idea, a sentiment I would put into the 3rd definition of humaneness. So we're looking at these 3 things through the lectures, this idea of what's been happening to humanity and how we've developed, what's happening with the sense of humanness and what does it mean to be human, and then are we seeing an evolution over time through human societies of something better quality of life, and dare I say, more love in the world, not hate, and not cruelty, and not indifference, and not ignorance, and not darkness. I think it was Shakespeare who said that the only darkness really is ignorance. So let's try to get smart with these lectures and really try and understand more about what's really been going on. Today, as always, we have a giant with us, somebody who has paved the way in their understanding of human history and an understanding of the relationship that the human has with planet Earth, with this larger world. And today it is James Lovelock, who has written extensively on the environmental world, on the impact of the human being on the natural world. And there is a quote from him that I will be building towards in today's lecture, The Ascent of Humanity. And in order to understand that quote, which is a powerful quote, I need to get you there. And I'm going to be traveling from the Great Divergence 7 million years ago right up until the starting line, which is what Jared Diamond has called the beginning of civilization. And that is around 10 to 13,000 years ago, when the last ice age was beginning to retreat and the world warmed up and created the conditions that allowed us to take advantage of the warmer weather and the greater opportunities in growing our own food. We're going to get to that next week when we start to see civilization really taking off. But James Lovelock, in The Vanishing Face of Gaia, issues a pretty stark warning about where humanity has come to in the 21st century. He is an important visionary and historian and scientist along the lines of Jacob Bronowski from last lecture, where we begin, who talked about the idea of the coming of the new mind. And I will be referring more to Jacob Bronowski again today, because he provides us with his human history and his classic, with a real understanding of what the beginning of technology meant for all of us. And that's where I will get you to today as we move through these 7 million years from the Great Divergence up into the beginning of civilization, is you're going to understand something about the origins of technology that should inspire you. Nonetheless, for the sake of balance and truth in this class and in these lectures, we have to also refer to James Lovelock. He provides us with a quote at the end today, but in his book, he also provides us with a stark and difficult to absorb idea emotionally. The idea that we may be doing so much to the natural world. I'm not going to say damage. That's too dystopian. But we are at a point, unquestionably, and many scientists know this, and many others too, who think about the state of the human condition and the state of the planet today. We have reached a point where we are beginning to think of literally changing the name of the age in which we live, from previously the Holocene era, which is when the ice melted and the world warmed around 13 to 10,000 years ago, and we entered a new age in the world that allowed for the beginning of civilization. These ages in which we define what's been happening are often of geological significance. Something happens geologically on the planet, shifts its conditions, and so we put new names on these eras. There is a lot of research and discussion today around changing the name from Holocene to Anthropocene or Anthropocene, the age in which we live, which is the human age. Anthro is human, and scene is sort of change. Humans are changing nature. And James Lovelock would tell you in irreversible ways. That's a strong word, irreversible. I think as you explore this story with me over this semester, and we see what has shaped us, and we see our ability to solve problems and fix things, I would put myself more in the camp of optimists, realists, but perhaps not as stark as our great James Lovelock has put it. But then he's allowed, wizard-like in his old age, to have that vision and that mindset and that worldview, and he can certainly demonstrate why it is so. But let's try and look at all the ways that we can understand our predicament today on planet Earth. And it is a predicament, the power of the human being. How did we reach this point in such little time, to the extent that we would begin to literally change the climate? So I'm going to begin today by taking us back to the Great Divergence and just reminding ourselves of where we were last week. And also, I'd like to remind you of an important dimension in the story that will always help you to orient yourself, so that you know that what we are actually exploring in this class and in these lectures is true. It's not just theory. And I say this because when we begin to look at this larger story, we are always coming back to this idea of deep time. Time and the time scale in which we're exploring this story is much greater than anything you have really seen in history before. And the only way that we can really understand this idea of the greater story on planet Earth is when we go back and look at those creation myths and creation stories that we touched on in Where We Begin. And I'd just like to remind you that the scientific creation story that we are exploring in this course has something called evidence in it. And the evidence, as any evolutionary biologist would tell you, and I can certainly recommend one to read who is excellent, Jerry Coyne, who teaches at the University of Chicago and has written a book called Why Evolution is True. All of the geologists and evolutionary biologists and those who look at our early history understand there is a story in the rocks on planet Earth. The fossils and the evidence is there. And in this lecture today, as I take you through these 7 million years now from the Great Divergence up to the starting line, I'm going to end with two extraordinary figures. The two perhaps most important figures in this entire story. Two young men in the 19th century who were the ones who began to introduce the world to the idea that there has been this slow evolutionary process taking place on planet Earth, and it can be proved. And the first name of these two is Charles Darwin. I'm sure you know who he is, but there's somebody else that you've probably never heard of, and I'm going to tell you about him today. His name is Alfred Russel Wallace. And I'm going to get you to those two free thinkers so that you can begin to understand at the end of today's lecture exactly how we humans began to rise from all the other forms of life that had come and gone on this planet, and then how we began to diverge from those primates who were living in the eastern part of Africa. And you will really start to understand something more concrete about evolution. That does not mean, for those of you who are religious, and I've already been seeing this in the reflections, that the idea of how we have developed on this planet can be looked at in other ways in terms of the human imagination. But science has something that none of the religions do. You have to understand that. And Jerry Coyne is very, very uncompromising in the way he explains why evolution is true. There are certain basic facts that we have to appreciate, and I will try and identify those through this lecture today. But first, let's just start with this idea of deep time. And remember that the story of what's been happening over these last 7 million years has been left for us in the rocks, in the crust of the planet, in the layers that have built up over time, all the fossils that are there, all the bones and utensils that have been turning up and that we have been discovering and dating. They tell us a remarkable story about our origins. Let's just remember what a fossil is so that you will know that as we go forwards with these 7 million years, that you will trust that the information that is being brought to us from earth scientists, evolutionary biologists, geologists, and others is true. It doesn't mean it's complete. Any scientist would tell you that. It's a process. But it's as true as we can determine it at this point in time based on evidence. So, what is a fossil? Recall from where we begin. A fossil is a thing that was alive once upon a time on planet Earth on the same terrain and land on which we walk today, swimming in the same, moving in the same water that we have been moving in today. They were here. But then their bodies, when they died, some of their bodies were so well preserved in the rocks that sediment or ash had built up over these things and had pushed their bodies against the rock. The bodies over time had degraded and then dissolved and went away, but the print of that thing is still there. And that's what a fossil is. A fossil is not the real thing. The real thing is a bone or a utensil, some sort of object. A fossil is the print of that thing embedded into the rock. And we know about all of these different forms of life, endless forms, most beautiful, as Charles Darwin described them in his classic Origin of Species and Descent of Man, because we've seen the layers of the rocks, like the rings around a tree. The layers go to the Scarborough Bluffs, for example, or any cliff, and you will see layers and layers of rock built up over time. And in those layers, we have been seeing all these different forms of life, fossils, and we can determine something has been evolving over time from one to another. So I want to bring us back now to the great divergence 7 million years ago. And you saw at the end of the first lecture where we begin that around 7 million years ago, in the eastern part of Africa, called the Great Rift Valley, there was a primate, and there are many species of primates, whether it's an orangutan or it's a gorilla, whether it's a monkey or a chimpanzee. These are all primates, but they've all branched off into slightly different forms. We call them location-dependent forms. That they have evolved their shapes and sizes based on the habitat or location in which they have spent so much time. This is how evolution works. But gradually, as you began to see at the end of where we begin, there was a primate that came down from the trees and became gradually bipedal, stood up, was no longer a quadruped like the other primates who were living arboreally in the trees. And this primate, our very, very early ancestor, began not only to rise, physically rise, but then had a new form of power, the two free hands. Next week in Civilization, I'm going to introduce you to a giant in world history, one of our most important world historians, William McNeill, who has helped us to understand that when you look at the story of the human being on planet Earth and the rise of civilization and the spread of civilization, we can actually see a kind of narrative in there, the breakthroughs towards the realization or the acquisition of greater power. Power is very important in our rise. Power means we can do more. 3 million years ago, there was a time, approximately, when through the evidence that we have accumulated from the rocks, we can see that this early creature, the human, who had been now walking on the planet, beginning to survive on the planet, on the ground, not in the trees, not higher up, had begun to create some new tools. You're looking at, right now, one of the oldest tools. It's 3 million years old, and it's a rock. If you look at that rock closely, you can see that it has been shaped. Like many other rocks that have been discovered like this, it has been shaped by a human hand. And that hand has begun to, the process called knapping, K-N-A-P-P-I-N-G. It's a form of knapping where the human begins to chip away at the rock and create a new object. And we were doing something like this. We were taking not only rocks, but wood, the antlers of animals or the hair of animals as well. And we were beginning to look at these things and begin to create something new from them. And this thing, this new thing, this tool is technology. That's what technology is. It's just a tool that the human has fashioned from the natural world, but we'll begin to add things to it. We'll develop something even more complex, multi-part tools that will give us, and this is us now. This is our legacy here. This is you and this is me. Very early on in our history, we are looking around us and we are exploring and we are picking things up and we're creating things that are new. Now, you may wonder in this, what's actually happening here? Is this necessity is the mother of invention? Is this a human who has, in his imagination or her imagination, thought that the rock could become something else that would then give them more power? Perhaps. And it did eventually. And these items are going to grow into some very powerful tools. But we must also look at this idea that invention is also the mother of necessity. That out of curiosity and the desire to know and explore, just simple playfulness, experimentation, we can create new things that we truly believe we need and we can't do without. And I would point out to you that probably you did this on a fairly regular basis, probably a lot during the pandemic, because we've been in front of our computers and our screens for so long that you just go online and you'll just start searching. You'll click here, you'll click there, and before you know it, you are in some new place that has not only answered your question, but has given you something new and maybe even something important. You've just followed your natural curiosity to a place that possibly provide something new that could give you not just insight, but knowledge and more power. So in this period, we were doing this. We were picking things up and turning them into new things. And we were beginning to realize that the object that we created, let's say the stone from napping, where you could take a chip from that, something sharp that you had napped off the stone, and not only would you get a rock that's sort of smoother and sharper edged with a tip on it, but you'd have also a little piece that could be attached maybe to some wood that could become a spear. But that rock that had been fashioned into something new, what a weapon that was. It could be used not only to kill an animal more quickly, it could be used to skin the animal's hide more quickly. It could be used to help build some sort of structure from the animal's skin that could protect you and your blood relations, your family, from the natural elements. But let's take this idea further now. This idea that the human, the very early human, in this 7 million period, this human who has diverged from the trees is now beginning to look at the world in a different way and is beginning to do things with the natural elements, and the challenges that he will face in putting together a more complex tool, and the challenges in using that tool to bring down a more difficult or hostile creature or prepare something from that creature's carcass. That is actually going to start to impact on our brain size. And literally, anatomically, we will see the brain size increase in this creature and its cognitive capacities, its cognitive abilities growing. We also see in this period something about how we actually captured fire. Now, many of you would know that fire and our ability to reproduce it is a fundamental triumph for humanity in terms of the advantages it began to give us. Just think of what was happening in this period as we were observing fire in nature. It's very hard for you to think in these terms, because you're so used to now being able to take a match and just strike it and there's fire. So convenient. But there's a long process in getting to that point where we manufactured that little thing that gives us fire so conveniently. Let's go back to around 2 million years ago and try to understand what it must have been like for our early ancestors to look at lightning strike a tree, and the tree bursts into flames. Imagine seeing fire like this and realizing how incredibly powerful it is, how terrified we would have been of this. But then somehow, and we can't exactly say when this began in a very precise way, but somewhere around 3 million to 2 million years ago, because we can see the remains of fires at campsites that have been discovered by anthropologists and archaeologists. Imagine the human who wasn't afraid and who, in his mind, wanted to capture that power, or believed that perhaps it could be used. Maybe it was just a little curiosity. Maybe it was a very determined desire to find some way of protecting ourselves from other creatures. Maybe it was a visionary among us who saw what potential would be in cooking, boiling water, cooking meat, so that you're not eating raw meat anymore. And do you know how hygienic that will be? Do you know how much more meat can be consumed when you cook it that way, and how much easier it is on the system to digest? I can't imagine that we would have foresaw that when we saw fire burning in a forest. But we captured it. We figured it out. And in the figuring of things out, we start to give ourselves new powers. And James Lovelock is going to tell us something about that idea of power at the end of today's lecture that I think will resonate with all of you. In this period, we say around, and I'm jumping ahead now because I'd like to fast forward a little bit and try to just identify some of the breakthroughs more towards the realization of new powers for ourselves. I like what William McNeill has written in his classic, The Rise of the West, History of the Human Community. You will see that next week. I think it helps provide us with a pretty good framework, a scaffolding on which we can hang all of these different developments that have been important in the human story, breakthroughs towards the realization of greater power for ourselves. It makes sense. There's more to it. Of course there is. But this is an introductory world history, and it's important that we try to look at something that is clear and that we can build around. And the skeletal framework, if you will, for our story has a lot to do with these breakthroughs. Here's another one for you. Imagine a human now, 200,000 years ago. We'll call this the Great Awareness. This human is somebody who resembles us in many, many ways, in terms of brain size, in terms of physical size, in terms of all of the extremities. Essentially, 200,000 years ago, we had our present form. We didn't have our present culture. That's something civilization is going to bring, and that will change us. But our physical features are very much like what we have today, and particularly our cognitive abilities. This human mind at this point is beginning to recognize something. And I will go over to the board and put some important terms down. I also want to show you a video as well of Alfred Russel Wallace, but I want to get you there. I want to get you up to a place where we're getting to, and we'll be there shortly. And then I'll get over to the board and review some of these important terms. But this idea of awareness, consciousness, we were now at this point in our story understanding how to dominate animals around us, how to kill them, how to kill large animals, and how to use their parts to build habitats and clothes and other things that would give us advantages. We had fire. We also began to wonder more about the natural world. And this idea, this great awareness, is something that anthropologists have begun to help us to understand that the human mind was wondering, why do we die? Imagine that question. You don't ask that today. You just know that it's going to happen. And we happen to live in an age in the 21st century, in the third millennium, where we're literally beginning to create ways of extending our lifespan to such an extent that we may be able to prolong death much, much longer. But we all take that for granted. We're going to die. Early on, we, unlike all other creatures on this planet, began to wonder, well, if we're dying, if I'm burying somebody here, or I'm creating a ritual in honor of my close loved one who has left this world, what exactly is my purpose here? Why do I die? That must mean that I'm supposed to be doing something here while I live. Or what is the point of this living thing if I'm not going to be here anymore? And we're seeing the beginning through this understanding of our own mortality, the beginning of spiritual searching that will lead to the beginnings of our religions. Now remember, in our story, we are looking through these lectures at these two great forces, science and religion. And there will be others that come in: government, writing, freedom, evolution, of course. But religion is going to emerge as an important part of human civilization. And we think that long before there were established religions, long before, we were beginning to reckon with this idea of death. And that will add a greater sense of purpose to our lives, a greater sense of urgency, and it will lead to more questioning, and even the beginning of our understanding or appreciation of supernatural powers and God himself. As we go forwards, I want you to think more and more about these breakthroughs towards the realization of greater power. I'm going to go a little more quickly now so I can get to the video that I want to show you of these two wonderful free thinkers, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who through their own curiosity and perseverance and imagination were able to help us see what has been happening on this planet, and it is called evolution. Now, when you look at our story in terms of what was progressing, around 75,000 years ago, we have been able to determine through footprints that have been left, still preserved in the earth, often covered by volcanic ash or other elements that preserve those footprints, just the way fossils have been preserved in the crust of the earth. These prints that you're looking at right now behind me are in northern Africa, and they are human footprints, and they're about 75,000 years old. And what we have determined in our story is that we humans began to walk out of Africa. There's a wonderful website you can go to today. National Geographic has been chronicling the story of a reporter who over the last years has been trying to retrace the route that we humans took from about 75,000 years on, when we started to leave Africa and began to migrate across the planet. And this reporter is retracing the steps that we took. And I highly recommend you spending some time on that website, the National Geographic's Reporter's Journey Through Our Human Origins, to understand something about what we began to do when we began to leave the eastern part of Africa. We humans always exploring more, seeking more. Yes, that is very much a part of who we are, but also we were led by our animals. Where the animals went, where the fauna went, we needed that fauna, those large creatures, to nourish ourselves and build our habitats with their skins and other parts of them. So if an animal went in a certain direction, we would follow them, we would hunt it down. And those animals led us out of Africa, and we began to walk and move and settle, not just in what is now the eastern side of Europe or the Mediterranean, but then we started to move further east into what is now India and China, and north into what is now Russia. And gradually we're going to begin to migrate and move around the planet. And this is how we started to populate the rest of the planet very slowly. Just our small groups of families that are moving together now. We have evidence in some of the caves where these early families were beginning to protect themselves from the elements. Sometimes they would be resting there. Sometimes they would settle there briefly, protect themselves inside. And we have found drawings, the walls of some of these caves. And they're remarkable in terms of their detail and what we were actually beginning to do. And I want to stop for a moment and help you to understand something about what we've discovered recently in a place called Lascaux in France. In Europe, if you look at the map, you can easily identify France. Of course, it's just there, north of Spain, and you can see that in this area of France today, in a series of caves, Lascaux, France, if you go deep into these caves, you can find these incredibly detailed drawings and sketches of large megafauna, mega animals, creatures on them. And imagine going into a cave that is dark, there's no artificial lighting in there, and you come in with a candle, or you come in with a flashlight, and then you flash that up onto a wall, and there you see this massive creature, life-size, drawn by humans around 20,000 years ago, sometimes 35,000 years ago, from the tip of the horn down to the nail on the foot, is around 6.5 to 7 feet. Why would we have been drawing these things there? This will give you an understanding now of how we are beginning to acquire greater power and domination over other creatures and other things on planet Earth, when you begin to understand what we were doing by putting these images up on walls. You might think that they were put there because we were becoming artistic, because we wanted to leave a record of something we had done, a hunt we had succeeded in, because we were just creative. That may be so. There might be an element of creativity in there, a desire to create something beautiful for others to see. It provides meaning of our lives and our realities. I am going to suggest another perspective from a very good world historian and historian of art, E.H. Gombrich. Short History of the World, or a Short History of Humanity he wrote, and also his classic A History of Art, which is a staple in art schools around the world. And in that, he talks about how when we were drawing these things, we were doing something that we will begin to do with language. That's coming. We are long away still from the written word. We are speaking slowly to one another now. We've developed a larynx or a voice box over time from about 75,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. So when we were creating these images on the walls and we were doing it collectively, we were talking or communicating to one another in a fairly simple way, but we couldn't write anything down yet. We didn't have anything like written language. But what we were beginning to do, as Gombrich tells us, is we were beginning to take out of our heads what was in our heads and put it in front of us, put it a kind of a mental, a representation, a physical representation of what was inside our heads so that we could see it. Because by doing that, you gain control over something. I don't think you've ever really thought in those terms before, but it's important you do. And we have a historian of Gombrich's caliber who can help us to understand this perspective. I'm not denying that art and the artistic impulse may have played a role in this, but we must think about something else. It's called strategic thinking. Imagine before a big hunt of a large creature that requires teamwork to take down. Imagine a family having to decide how are they going to attack this creature? Who's going to take the horns? Who's going to jump on the back? Who's going to be standing back and tossing the spears? And at what point do we all go in to take it down? This had to be thought about in advance. You can't just go out and meet a creature of that size and spontaneously bring it down with a few tosses of a spear and something else. It needs to be planned. And so what this may have represented was the idea of the planning for the hunt, the game plan. It's the coach of Sheldon, what's his name, Keefe, the Toronto Maple Leafs, who's in the dressing room with the Leafs, or it's Nick Nurse of the Toronto Raptors, with all the guys in the locker room before hitting the floor at the Air Canada center, and he's drawing out, this is how we're going to deal with LeBron James. We're gonna attack him this way, and this is how we're gonna deal with Sidney Crosby. And it's a game plan. It's a visual representation of what they were about to do. And by doing that, they could do this. They could take those creatures down. We are, in this period of 7 million years from the Great Divergence up until the beginning of civilization, we humans are learning how to begin to dominate the flora and the fauna around us, the other natural elements around us. We're learning how to exploit them, manipulate them, do what with them, survive with them, eat them, build things with them. That raises a philosophical question about what will we really be doing in the long run by acquiring this power. We will get there. We are acquiring this power now through collective, strategic thinking and courage, that we small creatures are able to begin to eventually destroy all the megafauna on our planet, of the megafauna extinction, and we will clear the ground for civilization. I want to stop for a second and bring up this video, because I'm at an important place in the story now, and I'm going to jump ahead in time so that you can understand something about the two principal figures in this story who have helped us to recognize that there has been this long evolutionary process of change on planet Earth that has led to us, that we were not just placed here whole by some divine force that has given us dominion over all the other creatures on this planet. No, we evolved out of all of this over a slow period of time. And there were certain steps in this, the breakthroughs, as William McNeill has told us, that reveal something to you about how we were shaped by the evolutionary process. To simply say, as our religions do, and our tribal creation myths do, that we were somehow just placed here, is beautiful. It represents something about the human imagination that wants to understand our creation. But it's simplistic. Imagine 2 million years ago, if our early ancestor had said, the fire, such power. The God of the fire is telling us something, and we must be obedient to it. We could never really know how that fire was created. It is such a massive force. Imagine the early humans saying about the saber-toothed tiger, the woolly mammoth, the giant sloth, all these large megafauna that were in the Americas 15 to 20,000 years ago in our continent. These huge creatures, we took them down, we killed them off. Imagine if we had said, a mammoth, oof, we must pray to it. That saber-toothed tiger, we will create a god, saber-toothed tigers, and we will never attempt to get close to that tiger. We will simply respect it. Would we be here Would we be here if we had not had that curiosity, that courage, and that perseverance to do something with the natural world and transform it? No, we would not. And so I want all of you, please, to not be afraid. Those among you who cling to your scriptures, it doesn't matter whether the scriptures of your Buddhist, your Hindu, your Iroquois, your Muslim, Jewish, or Christian faith, these are works of human imagination. And that is a wonderful thing, the human imagination, but it is not the real thing. We are living in a time in history where the power of science and the power of the men and women who have thought about these things deeply are revealing to us things that we never thought possible. Can our religions help us with that? Yes, but they can't lead us. They can't lead us to those new, unexplored parts of the natural world. Only the people like Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace could. Imagine Charles Darwin in the early 1800s, who arrives at the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador in the Pacific Ocean. Let me bring the map back, and so that you can see, come back map. You can see the Galapagos Islands if you look on the map right now, and you can see Brazil and you can see Ecuador. And then if you just keep moving your eyes, sort of going left or going west, and you will see a tiny little speck there. And those are the Galapagos Islands. Even the little Galapagos Islands are identified on this map, which has missed many things. But there are the Galapagos Islands, because once upon a time in the 1800s, there was an adventurous, young, scientific explorer who defied his father, who wanted him to become a parish priest. But he was too curious, and he went on an adventure. Now, I'm going to stop for a moment, because I'm now reaching the conclusion of the Ascent of Humanity. And I'd like to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes or so introducing you now to these two principal figures, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, because they are the humans that represent the qualities that I just identified. They deep down were scientists. They wanted to understand the natural world in ways that they knew would reveal to us more, that they felt that the knowledge around them at that time was not complete enough. And they were curious. And Charles Darwin was led to the Galapagos Islands in the 1820s and the 1830s. And it was there in the Galapagos Islands that he would make his great early discoveries. And it was also in another part of the world, several decades later, that Alfred Russel Wallace would do the very same thing. And I want to show you this video now so that you can understand who he was and what was driving him. Let me just tee this up. And I will push it out to you so it's full screen. I'm going to just stop it because I want to. That's coming from the International Space Station. Let me stop that for a moment. Okay, or actually, I'll just kill the audio on that. Good. Okay. So let me come back to this video. Alfred Russel Wallace. Done? There we go. This is a little documentary that appeared on the New York Times' website. They do small documentaries, and this is a lovely interpretation of Alfred Russel Wallace's work and his life. What you're about to see is the story of a young adventurer who made a critical discovery about the natural world. He went to the other side, to the eastern world, the Malay archipelago around Malaysia, a series of islands. An archipelago is a series of islands. And he saw the same thing, more or less, that Charles Darwin saw, the Western world, the Galapagos Islands. So as you look at the map of the world, Charles Darwin was over in the Galapagos, just off Brazil. And then about 30 years later, Alfred Russel Wallace over in Malaysia, just north of Australia, small country, series of islands. He would also see the same thing. And this is what we say is the beginning of fact. When two people, independent of one another, see the same thing, then we can begin to determine that this is true. This is real. And eventually, as you will see in the video, in 1859, when Charles Darwin's masterpiece that was a groundbreaking work in changing our view of ourselves, The Origin of Species, and when we began to understand that we had evolved from lower forms of life, that we were not just placed here whole by a divine creature, he will also co-author his work with Alfred Russel Wallace, because Alfred Russel Wallace had been in touch with Charles Darwin. Darwin had been ahead of Wallace. He got the attention. But Wallace gave him a lot of information, as you're about to see. And the two of them are so important as a pair in helping us to understand evolution. Excuse me, planet. Let's watch this lovely video to understand something about the mindset of these free thinkers and what they discovered, and how this is now bringing us up to the beginnings of civilization. Here we go.
Evolution by natural selection. This is an idea that has been sought after since the dawn of human thought. And it was a theory that was discovered by two people, and we've blithely forgotten one of them. What on earth has happened to poor old Alfred Russel Wallace?
Alfred Russel Wallace was born in 1823 in a small cottage by the banks of the River Usk in Wales.
He works with his brother and they're surveying the British countryside. He becomes interested in plants. And this is Britain. There's not even that much to become interested in. I say that with a certain amount of national pride. And in 1844, he meets Henry Walter Bates.
Bates turned out to be a really keen beetle collector.
So, okay, here we are collecting beetles in miserable Britain. We can do better than this. We can do real science.
He suggested to Bates that they both go off to Brazil and collect mainly insects but also birds.
These are two know-nothings. They don't have any money, they've been nowhere, and they decide to go to the tropics. I mean, this is the equivalent today of going to Mars. It's just so unimaginably bold.
They headed off to Brazil, worked together for a while, and then decided to split up and concentrate on different areas of the Amazon.
Wallace was the modern equivalent of a backpacker. Basically traveling by himself. He's dependent upon local help. Everything is stuffed into a dugout canoe, and yet he's trying to do science. And collecting stuff, which is the worst kind of science to do under those circumstances, because you're just accumulating enormous amounts of stuff. Spider monkeys, toucans, parrots, fantastic, gaudy things. So he has this vision. He's going to walk into a London scientific salon with a toucan on his arm. He's not going to be a nobody, he's going to be a somebody.
What happened next was that 26 days into the voyage, when the ship was kind of in the middle of the Atlantic, it caught fire.
Ship's on fire, it's going up like a tinderbox.
And they watched the ship sink.
Wallace got to visualize the collections which he'd nearly died for, those living animals, those pets that were his passport to the big time. He watches everything go up, literally, in flames.
10 days later, they were very luckily rescued by an old leaky ship that was going back to England.
And he writes this poignant letter, as one would. It's nice to be back. I'm never going to see again. But if he wants to realize that ambition to become, quote, a scientist, he's got to do it again.
Wallace decided, where next?
He's off again, this time to Southeast Asia.
He collected an astonishing total of 126,000 specimens of natural history, and out of all the specimens he collected, several thousand were new to science.
He's doing the backpacker thing again. He's struggling to survive. He's getting attacked by his specimens keep getting stolen by dogs. And yet he's still finding time in between bouts of malaria to really think big picture.
He was in a little village, racked by malarial fits. During this illness, Wallace was really thinking about natural history and the distribution of plants and animals in space and time.
The notion was that species changed one into another through time. And for whatever reason, ping, yes, there was his eureka moment.
Wallace realized basically there's constant death and struggle in the natural world.
There's finite resources, therefore a competition. So who's going to win that competition? Well, the best endowed.
And this provided a mechanism driving evolution, natural selection.
If you want a eureka moment, that's pretty eureka-y. Famously, as soon as he's capable of holding a pen, he writes out his manuscript.
Because he knew that Charles Darwin was interested in evolution, he posted the scientific essay off to Darwin. When Darwin opened Wallace's essay and started to read it, he was absolutely shocked.
Darwin wrote, Wallace could have seen one of my manuscripts and used its chapter headings as his topic sentences. Darwin cobbles together a set of notes to be presented alongside Wallace's. The next thing that happened, of course, was it galvanized Darwin into scribble, scribble, scribble. The Origin of Species, published in November 1859, does mention Wallace in the preface, but it's my theory. Here it is. And look, to a certain extent, fair enough. He's been working on this for a long time. Does Wallace go through and count the number of times he's referred to? Does Wallace get excuse me? No. Wallace loves the book, says, no, God, look, Darwin knows so much, I couldn't have done this.
I suppose I hate sort of injustice, and I feel that at the moment the history of biology has a very Darwinocentric view. People like Wallace actually made massive contributions, and they deserve to be remembered as well.
It's the greatness of the idea that they had, which should give him prominence, which is this idea that everyone's been seeking forever, where we come from and how we relate to the rest of the natural world.
I'm going to end here. I actually have a little bit more to provide at this point in terms of understanding the theory of evolution through natural selection and why it's so fundamentally important in this story, and how genetic science through the 20th century has only just confirmed and confirmed and confirmed again what Darwin and Wallace saw. I'll leave that until the beginning in the review of the next lecture, Civilization. And I'll start that, excuse me, at the smartboard. Didn't even get over there today, but I'll make sure we get those important terms down, and then we can jump into the beginning of societies and civilizations and really kick up this story a notch next week when we start to spend the rest of the story within essentially 10,000 years. The Great Experiment, Human Civilization. Ronald Wright has described it as, in his short history of progress, the Great Experiment, Human Civilization on planet Earth. I'd like to leave you with this image of Alfred Russel Wallace and a few words from that lovely video that you just saw. And I'm also going to save the words of James Lovelock for the review next week. Hold you in a little suspense, a cliffhanger, because I really want to leave you with this picture of Alfred Russel Wallace and this kind of individual who is so important in our story. He really did think big picture. He was so fascinated by plants and animals in space and time, but to really think big picture. I'm going to conclude by just reminding you of something about history and about how perhaps you're seeing something new, particularly for the men. I suspect that when you decided that you were going to take short history of the world, men, you're going to learn about war, about warriors and battles and Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Napoleon, and Charlemagne, and the Crusades, and all the brave kings and emperors who lorded it over everybody else, and who have been the ones whose stories have dominated history. They are coming, sure enough. I'm fascinated by them too. But you know something? When it really comes to the people in history that matter to our lives every day, I think that people like Alfred Russel Wallace matter more than anything. They believed in life, not death. They were not cruel. They were curious. They wanted truth. They believed in growth. They celebrated the world. They were tough. Do not think that a soldier, just because he is trained so well in basic training, is more brave than these men were. Imagine going alone into the wild the way they did. They risked their lives. Alfred Russel Wallace, on his first trip back from the part of the world where Charles Darwin went, he lost all his specimens in a fire. He almost died at sea. And when he got back to England, years later, he picked up the pieces and he decided now to go east and do it again. He persevered. He had imagination. He had courage. He had perseverance. I'd just like to remind you that there are many other people in the historical story, not just the kings, not just the generals, not just the warriors and the soldiers, and not just military strategy and tactics, all of which are important. Yes, I'm not saying they aren't, but so is Alfred Russel. Very important. See you next lecture.